Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I've found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a short story that I read because it is Short Story Tuesday. And today's short story is from an author that, as I mentioned in my TBR video, I can't believe I haven't gotten to yet. And after reading this, I definitely want to read more of them. And so today's short story is all about staring at the wall and thinking thoughts. Sounds ridiculous. I am referring to The Mark on the Wall by Virginia Woolf, which was published in 1921. For those who don't know, Virginia Woolf is a British author who lived between the late 1800s and the mid 1900s. She is one of the more well-regarded, best-known British writers, at least from the early 1900s, that time period. She frequently wrote about women and feminist ideas. She pioneered the use of stream of consciousness, which you see in the story that I'm going to be talking about today. Not usually a fan of it, but I do like how Virginia is using it here. She's known. She wrote a bunch of books like Mrs. Dalloway, novels and stuff. She also wrote a great number of short stories, which I'll be I'll probably be talking about more in the future. And she also wrote a number of essays too. She's a lot of people have torn opinions of her because she was viewed as largely progressive in her feminism, but it appears that feminism didn't extend to the lower classes and to people of color. So it definitely seems like she's your typical, first wave feminist at the time who believed that excluding minorities and whatnot would get them more rights because, it would be more appealing to the British men of the time, or even the American men of the time, which indeed it did. And that's sort of a bad lesson to learn, but it appears that, upper class white women have sort of synthesized that message for quite some time. Problematic beliefs and whatnot. And it also appears that she might have been bisexual, as she had a number of relationships with other women, but she did marry a man, and people have reported that they had a pretty good relationship. So, LGBT icon? No, probably not, but something to consider there as well. Without further ado, let's talk about The Mark on the Wall. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So The Mark on the Wall is actually a pretty short story. It focuses on an unnamed narrator sort of looking at a black mark on their wall in the past. The narrator is uncertain of the origin of the wall, or of the black mark. They think it might have come from a nail, but they don't know for certain, and they're not getting up to look at it. It's really their thought process at that time. It causes them to think about life and trees, and the trees seem to signify a death of some sort. The narrator is thinking quite a bit about death in this story. They are trying to think more pleasant thoughts, but their thoughts always turn back to the black mark and death and the fleeting nature of life. They also think about the old house owners and what they could have done to contribute to this black mark on the wall. They also think about archbishops and the nature of reality, which is pretty funny to me. And then as the story comes to a close, the narrator is interrupted by someone talking about the newspaper, and that person also notes that there's a snail on the wall, and the narrator goes, "Oh, it was a snail this whole time," and that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, there is quite a bit to think about with The Mark on the Wall. One of the things that Virginia Woolf does in this story, and I'll probably be talking a lot more about what she does than the content of of the story itself, because there is a little bit to think. There is a lot to think about there, but it's more how she tells the story that I feel is important here. Like, one of the things that she focuses on or uses is that of the stream of consciousness technique, or it's really focused on showing us thought process in general. I really haven't encountered too many stories that are just thought process, like a person thinking. I know we tried this technique when I was in high school, where my teacher, instructed us to just write for like an hour at a time, or maybe 15 minutes, 30 minutes, something like that, and just write all our thoughts out, and we could refine them later or whatnot. But I think that's what Virginia Woolf is trying to hear. She's using stream of consciousness to show how one considers changes to their world. The narrator, lived in a very specific type of world, but that didn't exist with that black mark. But when the black mark shows up, we're given a view inside their mind of what that change means for them, and the other things that they might be thinking about at the time, or that come into their mind as they're considering that black mark on the wall. The narrator moves from thought to thought, but always comes back to the black mark. It's just a bunch of different thoughts scattered throughout the story, but it's always that return to the black mark. Like, they're thinking about the archbishops and in reality, and thinking about the previous owners, but it's always like what those things mean in relation to the black mark. And the story can be a bit disjointed because of that. Much like how our thoughts are always disjointed. I'm very mindful of my thought process at times, and it's always like, oh, I'm thinking about this. Also, I'm thinking about that, and this and that, and this and that, and this and that. And that might just be a symptom of ADHD or autism or something like that. But I feel like most people think that way, especially when they're sort of unstimulated or something like that, where they're not in an environment where something is happening and all they're really left to is their own thoughts, much like the narrator is in this story. But even though it can be disjointed, it's still consistent in that disjointedness, where the narrator is always, again, coming back to that black mark on the wall. But I also like how she uses the stream of consciousness to kind of illustrate intrusive thoughts. Because even the narrator notes in the story, like, I don't want to be thinking about X, Y, or Z, but those thoughts always come back into the mind. And a lot of people frequently talk about that in this day and age, about thoughts that, you're trying to fight or whatnot. Although psychologists always indicate that it's best not to fight those intrusive thoughts. Just let them be mindful, let them flow on through, because if you dwell on them, it's only going to get worse. So I like how Virginia Woolf is able to use stream of consciousness here to really show the thought process and intrusive thoughts, and it's something that I really haven't encountered before. Virginia Woolf also seems to be talking about the nature of life in this story. The narrator seems to realize the fleeting nature as time progresses through this story, becoming slowly aware that death is a very real possibility, and that ultimately we might all become trees or something like that. There is an interesting quote that I would like to read to you. "It is full of peaceful thoughts, happy thoughts, this tree. I should like to take each one separately, but something is getting in the way. Where was I? What has it all been about? A tree, a river, the downs, Whitaker's Almanac, the fields of asphodel? I can't remember a thing. Everything's moving, falling, slipping, vanishing. There is a vast upheaval of matter." And I think, again, that might be referring to the nature of reality, but I think it's more about the nature of life, how everything is kind of fleeting, and you might want to focus on a very specific thought, and the peaceful nature of things, but it quickly slips out of your grasp. And I think the black mark on the wall refers to sort of death. Like, it's the narrator is trying to focus on peaceful thoughts, but the black mark constantly reminds them that death is coming for them, because black has so often been associated with the color of death. And this brings a sort of nihilism to the story, because everything, like when they think about the black mark, like it's sort of life feels hopeless, maybe even a little bit of meaninglessness added to it. Because if you focus on only death and how one day we'll just feed into the trees and whatnot, does any of this actually sort of matter? I think that given what the narrator is saying, like, no, it probably doesn't matter. Like, ultimately, everything just kind of means nothing, and it's a very bleak element to a pretty good story. Also, petty daily events are unimportant, but given that at the end of the story we find out that the black mark is actually just a snail on the wall, and the narrator's like, oh, it was just a snail. That's what it was this entire time. I think you could take that two different ways. It could be feeding into this sort of nihilistic thing, where like the thing that we tried to give meaning to is ultimately nothing. And so, I was right this whole time. Or it could just bring hilarity to all of this. Like, it's not worth thinking about death or anything like that, because in the end, like, the things that we try to, ascribe meaning to are just silly and unimportant, like the archbishops. Not so much a nihilistic take, like you could still believe God with all the hilarity, but like, trying to ascribe meaning to such grand things or even such small things is silly. Like, she's sort of making a joke of all of this. So I think you could take it either way here. Another important element of this story, similar to the stream of consciousness, is that of metaphor or comparison. I do think that the use of metaphor in this story is pretty strong, or like just comparing one thing to another. I don't know if that's specifically metaphor, but it does seem like Woolf is using that here. Allow me to read you a quote from this. They wanted to leave this house because they wanted to change their style of furniture, so he said. And he was in the process of saying that, in his opinion, art should have ideas behind it, when we were torn asunder, as one is torn from the old lady about to pour out tea and the young man about to hit the tennis ball in the back garden of the suburban villa, as one rushes past in the train. And that's really interesting. Like, she uses that quite a bit in this story, kind of ending each paragraph with something of a metaphor or a comparison. Like, you're rushing past in a train, you're only getting one bit of information as you look at the people that the train is passing. Saying a lot about life through these comparisons, and talking about death as well. And I think because there's so many of these metaphors, so many of these comparisons in the story, I think it's the strongest indicator that this is not meant to be taken literally. Of course, not every story should necessarily be considered literal. Like, there's always something underneath it. But with Virginia Woolf's story here, I think that's especially true. She's like, on the surface, like, it's not simply about the black mark. The black mark is not what the narrator is specifically focusing on. It's what the black mark represents. It's what life and death represent to the narrator in this story. I know this doesn't seem like a grand realization, but it's always important to acknowledge that what the author is saying isn't actually what they mean, and that this is mostly a metaphor or a very strong comparison or something like that. And it's always just important to acknowledge that, especially if you're going to be reading this because I think this might be, presented in a high school or something like that, because Virginia Woolf is one of those authors that high schoolers and middle schoolers are always introduced to. Anyway, so those are my thoughts on The Mark on the Wall by Virginia Woolf. A really good short story, one that I wasn't expecting to be as high quality as it was, but that's more on me because I just have a weird opinion sometimes of these older authors. Even though Lucas at the Bits of Lit, he was very high on Virginia Woolf at one point. So I urge you to go check out his videos as well, as he might have some interesting things to say about Virginia Woolf. But yeah, I definitely recommend that you go seek this one out. I will put a link to it in the description. Read it. Let me know what you think about it in the comments below. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and possibly join the Discord so that other people can find out about about The Mark on the Wall or this author if they don't already know, or just so we can have a bigger discussion about books in the Discord. And until then, I wish you the best of luck and your weird and intrusive thoughts travel. Farewell.